Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, and that happens to be for the 5th of October. And I apologize that I wasn't able to get our video in by 10 a.m. today, which is what I'm aiming for Tuesdays and Thursdays. I had some technical issues. So as a result, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the due date for today's attendance question. So hopefully that'll make up for that. And what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about paper topics for class and also talk about some upcoming short stories, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. And not that we've got a paper due anytime soon, but I wanted you to begin thinking about the idea of writing papers. If you remember, we talked a little bit about journals, and that ultimately, when we are done with our short stories section, I'm going to ask you to select 3 short stories and to write about a page or so in response to each of those short stories. So you would end up with a journal of about 3 pages. And I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And I'm grading it informally on a checkmark system. So basically, the idea is that we're having a kind of conversation on paper. And my hope is that when you write that and I return it back to you with some of my comments, that might help inform some decisions for you in terms of writing a paper, which is what we will be doing a couple of weeks after the journals have been submitted. You'll be writing your first formal paper. And we'll talk a little bit about the conventions of writing a paper, though I'm hopeful that this is review for you, that you would have talked about this in Composition 1. But basically, you have the option of rewriting the first paper if you'd so like for a higher grade. And I don't feel like I'm really giving away anything. This is the way real writers write, is that they go through a kind of editorial process and revision process. So I think that that's a wonderful way to learn how to write and to improve your writing. So again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but if you're feeling a little bit of anxiety about the first paper, even though it's something that we haven't much talked about, please don't, because you can always rewrite it for a higher grade. But I thought that now that we are in the midst of short stories, it would be good for you to at least be thinking about possible paper topics for short stories. So you'll see in the syllabus and other documents folder, what I've got is a handout about paper topics fiction. That paper number 1 will be a critical paper. In other words, you don't have to consult any outside sources. You don't need to do a research paper. This is based on your own interpretations and readings. That said, if you have your heart set on a research paper, let me know. We can always negotiate. And then basically the paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to do a good job of analysis, where you're talking about one element within a short story. So I just try to generate some paper topics based on elements that are important in the short stories. And this also can serve as a kind of hint about some of the things that we will be reading about in the future and what you should be looking for. You can choose any of the topics listed, or you can write also on your own topics. So that's perfectly fine as well if you wanted to do that. And in fact, I encourage that. And if you choose to write on your own topic, please approve the topic with me before you begin any kind of serious composing. And in fact, it always makes sense for you to touch base with me about your paper. And as I indicated, the journals might be a good way for you to sort of play out ideas for your paper. Not that the journals have to be connected to the actual papers themselves. Now, the syllabus gives some information about paper formatting specifications, type, double space, 1-inch margins, that again, I'll talk a little bit more about in depth as the semester progresses. But I try to generate a topic for each of the short stories in our unit. So I started with The Sorrowful Woman. And the first topic that I came up with was discuss the theme of isolation in Godwin's A Sorrowful Woman. Now, obviously, this is a theme that can be examined in other texts as well, but it seemed to have particular relevance in A Sorrowful Woman, not just because the sorrowful woman isolates herself physically from her family, but also she feels isolated and alienated because of the expectations of society. Or number 2, discuss the use of symbolism in Chopin's Story of an Hour. This is another example in that you would find symbolism in many, many pieces. But the Story of an Hour was so short and the symbolism was so precise, symbolism associated with freedom, which is what Mrs. Mallard experiences. I thought that could be a good possibility. Or discuss the theme of death in Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. And when we were talking about A Rose for Emily, we were talking about the idea of not just Miss Emily's death, or her father's death, or Homer's death, but the death of an old way of life, a Southern aristocracy that was supported financially through a system of slavery. Or compare the theme of love in A Rose for Emily and Van der Zee's A Secret Sorrow. Now, A Secret Sorrow was our example of formulaic fiction, that it didn't have a whole lot of depth or complexity associated with it. But that would be interesting to examine in relation to something that does have depth and complexity to it, something like A Rose for Emily, since both of them deal with love, but love in very different sorts of ways. So perhaps that could be a possibility for you. Now, we haven't talked about some of the upcoming pieces, so this could perhaps serve as a clue to you about what will be coming over the course of the semester. Discuss the theme of ambiguity in Young Goodman Brown. Ambiguity is when something is unclear. You can never tell for certain what is happening, which we will talk about, obviously, in Young Goodman Brown. Or examine the role of conflict in Hemingway's A Soldier's Home. And basically, all pieces of literature have conflict embedded within them. But A Soldier's Home, as you may be able to tell from the title, is about a soldier. And soldiers go to war, and basically this is formalized conflict. So that seemed like it would be a good topic. Or discuss the theme of battle in Ellison's Battle Royal. Notice that's part of the actual title itself. When we're introduced to actually a boxing match, that is a battle, but there are other battles that are going on in this piece. And then the last two short stories we're going to be reading, Girl and Popular Mechanics. Very short indeed, only about a page and a half or so in length. So I thought perhaps you might feel comfortable comparing and contrasting them, especially because I'm suggesting your paper should be 4 to 5 pages long, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to satisfactorily defend your particular thesis. So to compare and contrast these last two pieces, Kincaid's Girl and Carver's Popular Mechanics. Now on the surface, might seem to be very different, but I would suggest that they also have similarities embedded within them. And then at the bottom, I've got a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, here's a quote, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? Close quotes, Biddle 9. You can see that that's in parentheses. This is called parenthetical documentation. The MLA system, Modern Language Association system that we use for quotation. And basically when we are quoting in a paper, we use quotation marks and to indicate that we are using exact language. If we're using a paraphrase, just using our own language to talk about what happened in a text, quote marks aren't necessary. And if you're using quotation marks, then you need to, in the parentheses, immediately following the quote, whether the sentence is completed or not, is indicate just enough information for the reader to be able to identify where to find that quote. For us, what I've done is I've indicated page number as well as author's last name. And if this were part of a paper, I could direct you to the ending of the paper where ultimately what you would have is a works cited page that would list the author's last name, first name, and then all of the details like publisher and place of publication and so forth. So you could find that edition and go to page 9 and find that particular quote. And if you're looking at this quote, you'll notice that there are square brackets embedded within the quote. And inside the square brackets, it says, or has the author. This is basically my language that I've inserted into the quote. And that's the punctuation that you use if you are inserting your own voice into a quote, square brackets. If you're leaving out a quote or elements of a quote somewhere between your start and your end point, you can start and end wherever you like, but someplace between those 2 points, you use what's called an ellipsis, 3 dots, or 3 periods. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we start talking about the construction of writing a paper. But I wanted you to at least consider possible paper topics as we progress throughout the semester. We'd finished up with Rose for Emily, and I was talking a little bit about the we narrator, which is particularly important with that short story because in many ways we learn more about the community than we ever do about Miss Emily. We don't get her perspective. And what we do know is that the community comes off as very unattractive, very petty, very self-centered. If you think about how ultimately they delight in Miss Emily's fall, it's almost the way that we treat celebrity in our current culture. And many people have said that in the United States, American celebrity is the equivalent of British royalty, in that we have respect and we put these individuals on pedestals, but we also take delight in their troubles and their frailties. And I think that's definitely the case with Miss Emily, and that there is a certain level of begrudging respect for her, also fear and intimidation because of her position and her former wealth, at least, if not current wealth. And also a certain delight in that she can be as troubled as any other individual can be. And I know that I certainly would not want to be in a community that gossips about me and that speculates that I'm on the verge of suicide and does nothing to intervene, which is exactly what we see in this particular story. So that we narrator, I think, is very important because it's Faulkner's commentary, not just on Miss Emily, but also the idea of the citizens of the South. And talking about how Faulkner would oftentimes write Gothic texts, Southern Gothic, where he would criticize the Southern way of life, he himself having grown up in the South and having lots of difficulties with the politics and some of the social norms associated with both the past and the present of the South in which he lived. And I think we can see that in A Rose for Emily. Young Goodman Brown is a text that is part of the literary canon, the set of works considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study. And basically, you might be familiar with Nathaniel Hawthorne. Perhaps you've read other pieces from him in the past, such as Scarlet Letter. I thought Young Goodman Brown was particularly important, and you can see I've included some links in the notes below if it turns out you don't have access to the textbook for these short stories. I think it's particularly important because it's an investigation of New England and how New England was formed. And obviously we are all in New England here, or I suspect we are. It's possible, I suppose, that you're taking this as an online class and you're located elsewhere, but Greenfield Community College is situated in Massachusetts, which is where the story takes place. In fact, it makes reference to Salem, which has lots of history and lots of folklore associated with it in terms of the Salem witch trials. And this is done very deliberately by the author because the author wants to investigate what happened during those witch trials and also talk a little bit about Puritanism, which is how New England was founded. And basically, the Puritans were a very strict religious sect in Europe, and because of the discrimination that they received, they decided to resettle, and they resettled and in the United States, and they made it into a New England, and that's where the term comes from, New England. So they left because they were persecuted, and then ironically, what do they begin to do once they are in New England? Begin to persecute others who have different religious or spiritual beliefs, which is connected to the witch trials, because oftentimes the Puritans basically were selecting women who were considered to be outsiders in society to accuse them of witchcraft. This was their way of persecuting that which was different. And that's part of what the story is about, is some of the hypocrisy that exists within humanity that might not seem like it's such a radical statement in our current times, but during the time in which this piece was written in 1835, it was a radical statement. And if you've ever had a respect or admiration for someone and that person has disappointed you, that person has shown that they're capable of frailty or flaw or sin, and then you have to try to reconcile how you are going to connect that to the person you thought they were, then perhaps you can understand a Young Goodman Brown. The piece is known as an allegory. It's meant to be deliberately representational and figurative. So while we have a specific story going on, it's supposed to be highly, highly symbolic. So Young Goodman Brown represents not just a person, but it also represents people. Goodman at the time was a title, much like Mr. But Goodman would illustrate that this was a good man, or all good men are going to be experiencing perhaps what young Goodman Brown experiences. Young being representational for innocence, for being naive, and obviously this is very much a coming of age story. And Brown has associations with the soil, which I think works very nicely because this story talks about what happens when individuals are soiled or they have sin. The story also takes place in the wilderness, that which is wild or untamed. And basically, the wilderness can be a metaphor for the journey that we all take in life, which is rather wild and untamed as well. Many fairy tales use this idea as well. And we begin at sunset, and the setting is perfect. This is the beginning of Descent and Darkness, and we assume that this is Goodman's role into Descent and Darkness. We're told about his wife, Faith, who is both an individual, but she also represents faith, religious faith, and also Goodman's faith in humanity. So when she tries to hold him back for a while, this is both literal and figurative. The idea that he's engaged in some sort of a dangerous journey in the forest. And of course, if Goodman was so good, why would he go into the forest on a dangerous journey in the first place, as we will continue to examine next class. Note that they are newlyweds. Again, that also represents being innocent and naive. They've been married 3 months. 3 is usually a very important number symbolically, particularly from a religious perspective, when you think about the Christian idea of Trinity and threes. And then Goodman comes across what appears to be some sort of a traveler that perhaps might have some supernatural abilities and maybe is the devil. And this is where the ambiguity comes in, is that we can never know for certain. As many pieces of the story that would seem to show that a witch meeting is happening, there are an equal number of pieces to suggest that this is a figment of Goodman's imagination or it's a dream. And in the end, we're not supposed to know. It doesn't matter whether it happened or not. Even Hawthorne himself will take time to directly ask us that question. Was this a dream of a witch meeting or not? And the response is, be it so if you will. In other words, it's not that important. What's important is how Goodman changes after he realizes that all of the seemingly goodly people in his society are on their way to engage in sin. And literally everybody is there, but what Goodman doesn't acknowledge is that he himself is there as well. And part of this story is the examination of how sin exists within all of us. We aren't completely good or completely evil. We are a combination of the two. Again, which would be very radical for Puritanism, that basically kept the idea of sin or savior or purity and nothing in between. So a soul was either saved in heaven or doomed to hellfire, again with no in between. So this is Hawthorne's radical way of sort of examining and questioning that philosophy. And as we move forward to some of the other pieces that I wanted to give you, and Goodman, of course, is so overcome because literally everybody is here at that witch meeting. Church leaders, including Goody Cloyce, who taught him his catechism, which means that she was his Sunday school teacher. Politicians, professionals, widows, family members, everybody. We were talking about literary analysis earlier on in the semester, and I said that there was going to be a text that would lend itself very nicely to deconstructionist criticism. In other words, looking for paradox and contradiction within a text, which makes the text deconstruct itself. And this was the text I was referencing, Young Goodman Brown, because of all of the pieces of evidence that would seem to point to a witch meeting and all of the pieces of evidence that would seem to not point to a witch meeting. You know, and the lesson that evil exists isn't just for Goodman, it's for us as readers. And then what I wanted to move forward to was Soldier's Home, which was the second story that I had assigned for today. And a more contemporary piece by yet another author that you might have some familiarity with, Ernest Hemingway, another author who is part of that literary canon considered by scholars and critics to be worth academic study. And one of the reasons why Hemingway is usually considered to be an easier read is that his language is more contemporary. Notice how in Goodman Brown the language is a little bit more archaic. Also, Hemingway uses a good amount of quotation, so we've got a good amount of dialogue in there. Dialogue is usually easier to read. Certainly, it's one of the reasons why watching television or a movie is easier than reading, because most of it is given to us, or the majority of it is given to us through dialogue. Now, and when you think about Soldier's Home, you definitely have to think about the title and begin questioning what is home. What is the difference between the house, the physical structure, and home, the place where you are understood and loved and wanted? And Krebs, our title character, is a soldier who's coming back from war. And we have a modern day term for what he's experiencing, PTSD. But at that time, they wouldn't have had that term. They did have a term called shell shock about soldiers returning back as veterans and being changed negatively because of the war. But his family and society doesn't really have an understanding of that. And in fact, we could perhaps even argue that in our own time period, maybe our society doesn't have a real understanding of that, even though we have a better understanding than we would have in the early 1900s or so. But what we see is basically Ernest Hemingway examining this idea of what it means to be a veteran when you return to civilian society. There is a good amount of symbolism in this particular piece. Krebs, by the way, means cancer in German. You can say that war itself is a kind of cancer that basically takes over and eats you up and can basically lead to your destruction. Notice that referring to Krebs by his surname is very military-like. And in the military, individuals are referred to by their surname to remove their individuality. Now, ultimately, Krebs's mother calls him by his first name. That makes sense. And his sister actually calls him a nickname, Hare, which is supposed to be a term of affection when you're using a nickname with someone. Hare is also, I think, H-A-R-E, that is, not H-A-I-R. Hare, I think, is an appropriate nickname for Krebs. Hare, the rabbit. When we think about rabbits being skittish and scared, and one can draw parallels with Krebs himself upon his return, or the idea of a rabbit hiding in a hole, and perhaps the soldier in the foxhole, and then eventually making his own home a kind of place to try to escape his past, because he isn't able to integrate back into society. He basically is spending all of his time at home alone with a lot of solitary activities. Reading, eating lunch at home, playing pool. Notice how significant the pool is, and that you have to aim and shoot when you play pool, just like you aim and shoot when you're in the military. Practicing the clarinet. Again, he's avoiding relationships because he doesn't want consequences. The assumption is that there were too many consequences when he was a soldier, including life and death consequences, and he wants to try to avoid that as much as possible. So he's interested in very superficial relationships. It's one of the reasons why he preferred the German girls, because they didn't probably speak English very well, so he didn't have to have long, convoluted conversations. And I'm quite aware that there is a very odd conversation that he has with his sister, where she's asking if he will be her beau, which means boyfriend. Think of this as more like hero worship. This is not about incest. This is more about a younger sister who worships her brother, and her brother who understands that nothing serious can come of this, so he can humor her, because they will never have a serious relationship. And this idea too of how ultimately, will you be my beau? It kind of reminds me of a young child saying that they're going to be marrying their parent. And again, it's nothing that's meant to be taken seriously. And we see this conversation that Harold has with his mother, which is quite different, because his mother has all kinds of expectations for him, in part because of the father's expectations. And notice Krebs's relationship with his father. They never have a direct conversation. This is particularly important because it illustrates how distant the two of them are. But basically, the idea behind both parents is that they want Krebs to reintegrate back into society and be, quote, normal, unquote, whatever normal is. For them, that means to get a job, get married, settle down, and Krebs is nowhere near that. And we see that at the very beginning when we are first shown Krebs's picture. And this is when he was in college, where he belonged to a fraternity, and they're all wearing basically the same height and style collar. In other words, they look very similar, which is what you find in the military as well. But the next picture from the military shows the ugly reality of the military, where the Rhine it doesn't show in the picture. In other words, part of the selling point of the military was that you could see the world. The uniforms don't fit. The men look too big for their uniforms. You might say that these soldiers have outgrown their former idealization of war and the military. And the girls aren't pretty. And again, that's was and perhaps still is another selling point of the military, is that this makes you attractive in romantic relationships. And that's not the case for Krebs at all. And it's not surprising that Krebs has difficulty praying, and he's questioning his religion. The idea of can there be a God when war exists is a philosophical and a spiritual question that oftentimes is raised. One assumes that religion was part of Krebs's background. He went to a Methodist college, after all. Certainly his mother is very religious and wants him to pray with her, and he can't. And at one point, he even tells her, I don't love you. I don't love anybody. And he takes it back. There's probably some truth to this, because love requires, well, you need to be vulnerable. And it comes with consequences. And I suspect Krebs is trying to avoid both. I don't know if he completely says, when he says, I don't love you, if he means it. After all, he begins to switch into a little boy mode where he even calls her mommy. It's almost like he's a child trying to get some sort of sympathy or empathy from her. And she's trying her best to understand them. She would bring him breakfast in bed. It reminds me so much of A Sorrowful Woman. But that's not the help or the support he needs. And it's not just from his family, it's from society as a whole. We see right at the very beginning how superficial and fickle civilian society is. The hero's greetings are over. It's thought that Krebs has returned too late from the war. And of course, how could you ever return too late from the war? Your duty is still as significant as any other duty. The ending of the piece, Krebs decides to go to Kansas City and get a job. And we could see that as a positive, and that he's moving on with his life. We could see it as a negative, and that he's running away from his problems and his family. He decides to watch indoor baseball, again as a positive. We could see that he's engaging in some sort of social activity, or a negative, that he's just doing what his sister wants so that she doesn't nag him anymore. And that's one of the things that I like about literature, when we aren't necessarily given a clear-cut pathway, because life is oftentimes filled with ambiguity, and life is oftentimes filled with complexity, which is what we see here. But it's very clear that when Krebs is offered the car, he understands that this is very simple. The parents want him to have the car so he can date and get a job and settle down. So cars ultimately, think about how most adolescents respond to cars, freedom and adulthood. But Krebs knows the price is much too high, that he's not willing to conform to his parents' expectations of normalcy. And again, it's hard to know how to feel about Krebs, just like it's hard to know how to feel about the sorrowful woman. We can empathize with the sorrowful woman, certainly, because of the restrictive role of society upon her. But she also has responsibilities to her husband and most certainly to her son. Same with Krebs. We can understand that he's not necessarily ready to reintegrate, but we also understand that he cannot continue to live his life in isolation, that eventually he's going to have to come to terms with what has happened to him and find a way to move on. And then the third piece that I had assigned for today is Battle Royal. This actually comes from a novel called Invisible Man. Not The Invisible Man, which happens to be a science fiction story, but Invisible Man, which is the story of a man who feels invisible because of his ethnicity. He happens to be an African American. This piece was written in 1947, pre-civil rights movement. So in many ways, we could say that pieces of literature like this one help bring about the civil rights movements, which goes to show the power of literature and other artistic forms. And this novel is basically, in my opinion, one of the best ever written, Invisible Man, because it reads like a short story in the sense that every single word pretty much has some sort of symbolic meaning to it. It's a wonderfully written piece that's several hundred pages long. Ralph Ellison was rather young when he wrote this, so the expectation is that if he wrote something this remarkable, and it received accolades right from the very beginning, that he would only do bigger and better things, and he did not. So he always had to live in the shadow of this. I suspect if he had written this at the ending of his career, it would have been seen as his crowning achievement, and it would have been very different for him. But even though it's a novel, the opening chapter was released as a short story, and that's called Battle Royal, and that's what we are reading in class as well. And this is about an adult narrator who happens to be reflecting on his youth, who feels that he's invisible because he's black. And we learn his story. Basically, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the novel, even though we aren't reading the novel in class, though I'm hopeful that you will one day read the novel on your own. Because the novel begins with a prelude where we've got the Invisible Man as an adult who happens to have broken into a basement in a very affluent Caucasian neighborhood, one he would never be allowed in because of being black. And he is surrounded by darkness because he's in the basement. But he's also found a way to steal electricity, or another way of saying that is to steal power. That's very important, the theme of power in this story, who has it and who doesn't. And he basically has set up hundreds of electric lights. So he's flooded in light as well as surrounded by darkness. And light and dark is a major theme in this story. And he talks about in this basement how he is basically hibernating. But he needs to tell his story first. And his story begins with that which we are reading in class, Battle Royal. And basically what happens in Battle Royal is that he believes he's being called by the leading citizens of town in order to read his graduation speech because it was so impressive. The reality is that it's a setup so that he can be degraded, misused, and abused. This is a very brutal story. And then finally, at the ending of that, he gives a speech, and he's hopeful that he can change their minds about him. They aren't really paying attention until he says a misstatement that would seem to suggest that he wants equality. Everything stops. He's required to apologize. And then at the end, they present him with a scholarship. And this seems to be something positive, that he's got a scholarship to go to school. But it's not, and there's some foreshadowing to indicate that it's not. We learn a little bit about the Invisible Man's grandfather, who on his deathbed basically said he was a traitor, and he lived with his head in the lion's mouth, and that his meekness was really all a lie, that he was just using that as a way to get access and eventually power in Caucasian society. But the Invisible Man doesn't understand that at that point. And also, the Invisible Man at the very ending has a dream about his grandfather, and his grandfather's at a circus, and his grandfather refuses to laugh. In other words, the grandfather refuses to engage in the expected behavior. And he has to open up letter after letter after letter. One is embedded inside another, almost like those nesting dolls. And then finally it says, keep this end boy running. And this is basically the invisible boy's subconscious that's telling him that he's never going to be given equality and hope and opportunity, regardless of how the American dream, and the American dream is a very important theme in this piece, is portrayed, that basically all men are created equal. Though, of course, that leaves out 50% of the population there with female, and men being Caucasian, upper middle class, Christian, and if we heterosexual, and if we continue to go through the categories, it's a very small group indeed. So what happens after this? Because we know what happens in the short story because I had assigned it. So what happens is he goes to college, and he spends about 200 or so pages in college, and he realizes that college is a lie for people like himself. College offers opportunity, but not the black people. So he realizes that that is not the answer to achieve success and equality and respect in society. He decides that what needs to happen is political reform. So he attempts to do that for a couple of 100 pages or so to change the system. And he realizes that the system is just as rigged as education is, and it's only meant for those with access and never meant for individuals who are disenfranchised to ever achieve any kind of power or equality in society. And then he ends up meeting a character by the name Ross the Destroyer. And he is just that. He likes to destroy things. Convinces the Invisible Man that what you need to do, or what they need to do, is to destroy the systems that are already in place and start anew, which is exactly what they do for about 200 pages or so. And the end result is a riot, and they're watching literally their neighborhoods burning down to the ground. And this is when the Invisible Man realizes that rebellion and revolution is not the answer either. So at the end, the ending of the novel, he ends up deciding that he needs to think. So he breaks into the basement of an all Caucasian neighborhood that he would never be allowed to live in, a very wealthy neighborhood. And he's surrounded by darkness, but he's able to steal some electricity or power, and he sets up all of these electric lights, so he's bathed in light as well as surrounded by darkness. In other words, the ending is just as the beginning. And he talks about how he's hibernating. And you think about the idea of hibernating, taking a break, but that assumes that eventually there's going to be an awakening and there's going to be some action that will occur, but we're not told what. And I always thought that was brilliant of Ellison, rather than Ellison supplying an answer to a question that we still grapple with in society, racism. Ellison is basically putting it in our laps as readers to try to grapple with this, which I think was very clever on his part. So that gives you an idea of the novel as a whole. Of course, I oversimplify. You need to actually read the novel in its entirety. But I did want us to read Battle Royal and that grandfather's deathbed confession, where he says he was a spy in the enemy's country, the enemy being Caucasian society. And a spy basically is someone who's pretending to be one thing and is really another in order to gain access or opportunity. That he lived with his head in the lion's mouth being Caucasian society, overcame him with yeses, pretended to be meek and subservient, but that isn't how he felt at all. And all of the leading citizens of the town are watching this boxing match. It almost reminds me of Goodman Brown, except note that here it's all of the leading male citizens who are enjoying the humiliating and the brutalizing boxing match that they've set up these African Americans to engage in. We get also some very brutal language here as well, use of the N-word. And we also get some commentary on sexism, because we are given the image of a female who basically is objectified and used for entertainment. She's a naked blonde and with an American flag tattooed on her, and the flag being symbolic of the United States itself and the American dream, where you can look and not touch. And of course, how horrible this would be for these men, because looking at a Caucasian woman or showing any kind of excitement, and both occurs, that could lead to actual death. So in addition to using, horrific language such as the N-word, which I think is important for us to read because it gives us a historical context, these individuals are put in an absolutely horrific situation that they can't win. They're wearing so little clothing in their boxing briefs that it's pretty clear that they are feeling physical excitement. And again, that could be something that could be punishable by death. And the Invisible Man talks about how he wants this naked blonde, but he also hates this naked blonde for that very reason. And then eventually we transition over to the boxing match. But note all the black and white imagery, which is a metaphor for, the tensions between black and white society. Tuxedos are black and white. The men are smoking black cigars. You can say that they are consuming something that's black, just like they consume the boxers. The Invisible Man's scholarship is wrapped in white tissue paper. Over and over again we see this. And that boxing match is a metaphor for both societal and personal battles. That this is the battle in society of the haves and the have-nots. This is also the battle between the individuals, the have-nots, who are scrambling for the crumbs, if you will, rather than uniting and trying to topple over the true enemy, the people in the position of power. At one point, the Invisible Man has left with one last boxer, the most powerful one, and it was deliberately planned that way. And he tries to convince the other boxer to fix the fight, and the boxer says no, because this is basically the only way he can get any kind of dignity or respect in the world is to at least win this fight. His only pride is in winning that. And then they're supposed to be earning money for this boxing match. We find out that's a lie, as so much in society is a lie. There's fake payment. They're supposed to try to pick up these pieces of gold on electrified rugs. And again, this idea of power and who has it and who doesn't and how is it misused. And it turns out they're just fake tokens as well. So all of this was a lie. And the Invisible Man still, even though on some levels, we can see small acts of rebellion, he's peeking through his blindfold, white blindfold. That's important because white society is basically trying to keep the truth away from Invisible Man. He's peeking through his white blindfold to try to see. At one point, he also almost topples over one of the men in the chair who happened to be drunk and taunting the naked blonde. So we can see that on some subconscious level, at least, the Invisible Man understands how he is being disrespected. But the majority of the Invisible Man still wants to give his graduation speech even after all of this, hoping that he can earn respect and dignity. And he makes a mistake. If you know anything about psychology, psychologists will oftentimes say that we make misstatements that are in one way or another reflective of our subconscious. And instead of saying social responsibility, he says social equality. And social equality is very different than social responsibility. This is where everything comes to a halt and he's confronted by the men and he apologizes and is ultimately given this scholarship, which would seem to be something that's good. But of course, he has a dream of the grandfather and that scholarship. And this is some negative foreshadowing of what's going to be occurring to the Invisible Man in the future. So these are the 3 short stories that I had assigned for today. What I'm going to do is to talk about them in greater depth next class. And we've got 2 last short stories to read and discuss. The good news is that they are both very short, Girl and Popular Mechanics. So if we start to fall behind, I suspect we might just a little bit, we can catch up. Notice we're getting towards the ending of our short story section, which means that we will be able to transition to our next genre or kind of writing, which will be drama, and we'll talk about that in class. And then we can also talk a little bit more about some of the writing assignments for short stories, the journals, and also for the papers as well. So the attendance question, again, I'm eliminating the due date because I wasn't able to post this by 10 today. Which of the 3 short stories that were assigned for today, Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, or Battle Royal, did you dislike the most and why? I know oftentimes we talk about what we like, but sometimes what we dislike is just as important, maybe even more important. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. What's interesting about this more is the rationalizations or the reasons why. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts and your reflections are. So basically, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will finish up with these 3 short stories and any odds and ends that I might have missed with Rose for Emily next class. And then eventually we end up with our 2 last short stories in this unit, and that happens to be that happens to be Popular Mechanics and Girl. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.